Good morning. Welcome to the Indiana IEP Resource Center series, Conversation with Authors. My name is Marcy Wilburn, and I'm the project coordinator with the center. We are excited today to welcome Cornelius Minor, co-author of We Got This, Equity, Access, and the Quest to Be Who Our Students Need Us to Be. We want to start with some logistics, as always. Please know that all microphones have been muted and all webcams are disabled for participants within today's session. However, throughout the session, we encourage you to post general comments and questions within the chat box. Remember that there's a drop-down within the chat box where you can post just to the host and the panelists or to everyone. So if you want your question to go to everyone, please make sure that is selected. Simply type your comment and then click send. Today's session will be captioned, as you all just heard. To enable the captions, click the closed caption button in the lower toolbar. If you have any technical difficulties today, please feel free to contact me. I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat box so you have that readily available. And at this time, I will pass it over to Cornelius to start the conversation about his book. Welcome, Cornelius.
Oh, wow. Like Marcy, thank you so much. And again, to all of our participants and attendees, thank you for being here. I am excited to be presenting just a little bit about my book, We Got This. And We Got This is a book that really attempts to capture this moment that we are all working, teaching, supporting students and communities through right now. That, of course, I am not the first to say that the last 2 years, 24 months, have been an incredibly challenging time for all of us, but specifically for educators. And so though my book was written before the pandemic, it has really, it seeks to really figure out, what does it mean to serve students powerfully in this moment? And so I wanted to start by just discussing some really big concepts that I present in the book. Now, of course, we've got 30 minutes together, so I won't be able to go through everything, but I am really so thrilled about working with you all because so much of my work here aligns with everything that you all are doing at the center. That I start in the book by acknowledging some really big truths. This idea that we right now are working through the greatest period of professional uncertainty in the last decade. That what we are attempting to do to educate students and to really see and understand them fully, given all of their unique and diverse needs, as we do it through a pandemic, right? This has never been done before. So as we work, our work will not be perfect or even predictable. In many instances, it will not even be comfortable, right? That this current pandemic and the shifts that we have made over the last 2 years have revealed to many what educators representing historically marginalized groups have been articulating for years. And that is the reality, that there are profound inequities in schooling. Now, here's the challenge in all of that work. The challenge is that we live in a society right now where classist and ableist and sexist and homophobic and transphobic and racist ideas and behaviors have been normalized and are viable and sometimes even rewarded in media and in policy. So we cannot choose to avoid these things in our classrooms and in our work with one another. Now, here's the fascinating challenge when it comes to actually existing in classroom and in school space, that some people mistake knowing about equity issues for actually doing equity work. And so We Got This as a book really seeks to address how do we move forward with the doing, understanding that there is no one best way to move forward, right? But each path forward does have some essential components. And the book really attempts to grapple with those essential components. So in the book, I really think about what is the self-work required to serve students powerfully? How do I have to reflect? How do I think about the way forward? In the book, I attempt to really understand and grapple with the idea of systemic awareness, right? Really thinking about what does it mean to be attentive, not just to the people in my classroom, not just to the experiences in my classroom, but to the systems that often dictate or govern how those people live their lives in my classroom or how those experiences come to be in my classroom. Of course, I take a look at active change making, that it's not enough to do the self work and to become systemically aware. But once I cultivate understanding, I use that understanding to create meaningful and measurable change for students. And then, of course, the book attempts to really grapple with powerful teaching, that all of this rests on a foundation of powerful teaching, that if kids aren't more literate, more numerate, more expressive, then we have missed the mark. Now, I'm really excited to be sharing with you today because we get to think through not just the ideas presented in my book, We Got This, but we really get to think about how those ideas meet us in this moment right now. That as we all work through this current moment, and I don't know how things are with you all there, but we are just finished with standardized testing here in New York City this week, right? As I sit with you today, our kids are just finishing the math exam. And as we have sought to support kids and to teach kids, given all of their unique needs, we've run into many challenges. And I think it's important to name right here in the very beginning of our exploration of this book that we're allowed to be angry about how things are. We're allowed to be sad. We're allowed to be unsure. We're allowed to be scared. As practitioners, we are human. And these things, these feelings are human, and they are appropriate for this moment. That we don't have to get over it. We don't have to get used to this. That We Got This is really about how we work together to forge a reality that is good for children and that is good for us. And so as we work today, and as you move through the book with your team, as you move through the book on your own, one of the questions that you'll see that I'm really thinking about is, what does it mean to have an instructional focus that is rooted in equity when things around us are already difficult? That's a really big question, and I attempt to make my way through it in We Got This. Now, as we move through our time together today, feel free to put questions in the chat, and I'll make sure to really connect those questions to the ideas presented in the book. Now, when I think about moving through difficulty, it's really an interesting idea, because there are so many times where many of us in school space or in institutional space have practiced moving through difficulty. And one of the things that I am really actually quite obsessed with is the difference between moving through difficulty, simply surviving difficulty, and actively facing difficulty. In We Got This, I really seek to illustrate the differences between these two. That simply moving through difficulty feels passive to me. That moving through difficulty says, well, if I just hold on, this will all be over soon, right? Or this thing must be happening to me. These hardships must be surrounding me somehow because I'm not working hard enough, right? Simply moving through difficulty, surviving, suggests that, oh, well, if I wait long enough, somebody in charge is going to have a solution for me. They're going to rescue me by telling me what to do. Moving through difficulty, for me, in many ways, especially when we're seeking to create equitable futures for our kids, does not address the difficulty itself. And like I've illustrated, we've been facing incredible times these last 2 years. And I am interested in exactly that, facing. Facing difficulty is profoundly different than moving through difficulty, because facing difficulty acknowledges that things, as we work together, will be messy, right? And some things will even be left undone as we pivot to meet the needs of students, as we pivot to privilege the things that students need, right? We're going to sometimes leave some things undone, and that's okay. This does not mean that we have failed as educators, that we can prioritize student learning without centering the dogmas that have historically been sold to us as the way. I think it's important to acknowledge that in this moment, solving the challenges that we face does not mean that things go back to how they used to be. This is not the goal, right? Things are not going to look like they used to look. It's important to acknowledge as we work together that facing difficulty ensures that we are the architects of our own experience and of our own institutional happiness. Now, these are big concepts, yes, but I'm interested in spending the rest of our time thinking together, well, what does this look like in my day-to-day? How does this go for me moving forward? right? And so I want to take into account, again, on the one hand, all of the difficulty that we're facing with all of the work that there is to be done, understanding that I am human and that you are human, right? And so I want to start with some really just kind of like foundational concepts. When we think about an inclusive curriculum, and many of you at the center already know this, right? That you've spent a lot of time thinking about this. When we think about an inclusive curriculum, and again, we're going to continue to grow and complicate this idea, not just this morning, but throughout all of the work that you do at the center. We know that an inclusive curriculum must be inclusive at the content level, right? That I'm always asking myself the question, are the materials that I'm using representative of the world that we actually live in, right? Not just my small community of Brooklyn, New York, but of the entire world, right? And is the thing that I'm teaching, are the resources that I'm using respectful of the disciplinary contributions made by various groups of people, right? And so that means when I'm seeking to create an inclusive curriculum, especially in terms of content, I've got to, of course, consider identity. So I'm considering gender and race and class. I'm considering ability. I'm considering language and geography, right? But the work does not end here. You know, that one common misconception in equity work is people fill their shelves in their classrooms with books and resources featuring Indigenous folks and queer folks and Black and brown folks and women, right? But that's not the entirety of the work, right? That if my shelves are full of books with brown folks and women on the cover, that's really, really powerful, but that is not the entirety of the work. Here's the thing. Using inclusive materials alone is not progress if I am still doing so in ways that are exclusive or in ways that deny access to particular students or groups. As such, it is also important to consider methodology. So in We Got This, I really show different ways that we can be inclusive, yes, on the content side, but then also on the methodology side. Now, when I think of methodology, and I am so connected to the work that you are already doing there at the center, I think often about universal design for learning, right? Understanding that there are multiple ways to engage kids in learning. There are multiple ways that we can share information with kids, right? So if the only way that I'm sharing information with kids is by lecturing at them for 40 to 45 minutes a day, then I'm leaving out all of the kids who learn powerfully when they experience, or learn powerfully when they build, or learn powerfully when they discuss, right? We also know that there are multiple ways that kids can express their knowing. So if the only way that a kid can express their genius in my class is by writing, I'm leaving out all of the kids who express their genius through illustration, or who express their genius by creating infographics or by building models, right? And so when I think about equity, I'm not just thinking about content, I am also thinking about methodology. Now I want to pause here because that's a really big concept, and the rest of our time together this morning is going to rest on that understanding. That so much of We Got This is built around the understanding that, again, simply knowing about various groups of people who share our planet, simply having books with women or brown folks or queer folks on the front isn't going to get us where we need to be. That we can create the in-class realities that allow multiple kinds of kids to coexist and to thrive in our classrooms. And we do that by thinking about methodology. Now, when I wrote this book, there were some really big essential questions that I was juggling. That when we think of traditional equity work as it happens in so many school spaces, that work is focused on kindness or on being nice, right? And there's nothing wrong with kindness. There's nothing wrong with being nice. Those are essential components. But here's the thing. Kindness alone will not get us to the sustainable future that we need for all children and communities. Being nice alone will not get us there. And so I've really been asking the question, what is equity in the context of teaching and learning that we do every day, and in the context of our communities? What are some common misconceptions that exist in our current work? And then given all the challenges that we face right now, what does it mean to do equitable work in the context of my classroom, right? That again, is simply being nice. And again, kindness and niceness are important, but simply being nice will not get us to where we need to be. And so as I juggle these three questions, I wanted to illustrate this in a very concrete way. How do all of these big concepts that I've described connect to our commitment to caring for kids, right? That when we consider equity, right, it's really easy, after seeing an attack or hearing harmful language, it's easy to see and understand the potential for harm that can sometimes exist in our communities. But here's the thing. Seeing the potential for harm that might exist in our own classrooms is not as easy for some folks. And so I want to spend a little bit of time this morning illustrating that I am channeling the wisdom of my grandmother here. My grandmother used to always remind me, she used to say, Cornelius, if you cannot see a problem, you certainly cannot fix a problem. So here is my attempt at rendering some of the problems and challenges that we face when it comes to equity visible. And I'll start with this illustration that I've drawn to the right of your screen here. So if you take a look at this pyramid and we start at the top together, one of the things that we already know from our studies at the center, we know that some approaches to teaching do not see all kids, right? We know that there are some approaches to teaching that do not acknowledge the unique or specific needs or abilities of kids, right? We know this, and we've studied this quite a bit. And often when I think about why people stay committed to those ways of teaching, it's because of things like tradition, right? People say, well, this is how we've always done math here, or this is how we've always done science, or this is how we've always done language arts, right? Or this is what the curriculum says. This is how it's supposed to be done. And so what ends up happening in so many school spaces is instead of thinking about how we might bend or remix curriculum to meet the unique needs of kids, what often happens in school spaces is we demand that kids conform to us. And here's the thing, and this is the central argument of We Got This. This is not okay. And I want to say this again. Instead of thinking sometimes at school, how might we create unique experiences that meet the needs of the students, what often happens in school is we demand that kids conform to us. And this is not okay. And here's the thing. If you look at the second layer of this pyramid, kids also know that this is not okay. Now, here's the thing. I am never going to get the perfectly worded email from a kid, right? So no kid ever is going to write me the email that says, Dear Mr. Minor, the way that you have chosen to construct this learning experience does not meet my needs as a learner. I'm rarely ever going to get that email from a kid. Rather, we see this in their behavior. We see this in their growth. We see this in their engagement or lack thereof, right? I'm thinking about the great Carla Shalaby, who wrote another fantastic book, Troublemakers. If you all haven't read it, it's an incredible book. And in that book, Carla Shalaby says that in school, behavior is a form of communication. Now, here's what often happens in school. Instead of reading these behaviors or this engagement as communication, we often label it as deficiency or as defiance. And then we use these labels to sort and to segregate kids. And so what ends up happening in so many school spaces is we treat kids as if they are broken. So conversations at school become all about how we quote unquote fix the bad kids, right? The bad kids. Here's the thing. None of the kids are bad, right? Instead, we can reflect inward, right? But instead of reflecting inward and thinking, how might we reimagine the school-based experience to better meet the needs of kids? Instead of reflecting inward, blame often gets shifted to children and to communities. And here's what I want to name very clearly today, that this trend that I have described using this pyramid happens disproportionately to multilingual children and to children with learning disabilities and to kids from groups that have been historically marginalized in institutions like school. And here's the tragic part of all of this, that this leads to less learning, which connects to so many other success indicators at school. And so ultimately what happens is that kids have fewer opportunities at school to learn. They have fewer opportunities in life because of how we have historically done school. And so here's my central thesis. If the ways that school operates have harmed some people, then we are allowed to reimagine what it means to do school. And when I think about what We Got This does as a book, We Got This is a reimagination manual. It's a tool to reimagine how school happens for you and for your kids every day so that we can forge better, brighter, stronger realities. Now, and again, I want to lean into this point because this is, the central argument of the book. Again, if the ways that school operates have historically harmed some people, then we can reimagine what it means to do school. That things should not be what they used to be, right? That one of the things that I feel that has been really, really heavy is that there's this idea where we're wedded to tradition or to how things are supposed to be. And if we want to powerfully serve all kids, we can walk away from the traditions that no longer serve us. Now, here's the thing. I've asked the question over and over, and this is something I grapple with a lot. Why do things keep staying the same in our school communities? That these are things that we have known for a while, that I am not the first to write about equity. But one of the things that I'm discovering, and this is an approach that I put forward in the book, is that imagination matters. That we talk all the time about innovation. We talk all the time about our commitment to students, but few people are actually willing to make the profound breaks with tradition in order to serve the kids who are most harmed by the ways that we have historically done school. And so in the book, there are lots of tools and approaches to really think about what it can mean to reimagine or remix how we do schools to better meet the needs of kids. One of those tools is an imagination protocol. And I put forward this imagination protocol so that teachers, educators, school leaders can use it to really think about how we might forge better paths forward that better meet the needs of kids. And so one of the first questions that I always ask myself is, who's often left out in our school community? When I am looking across my class or my grade team or my school, I might ask, who are the kids who aren't, getting what most other kids are getting, right? And here's how you'll know. You'll know when we look at things like grades or attendance or participation. Now, unfortunately, here's what often happens in school. The blame immediately gets shifted to kids, right? Oh, so this kid, their grades are low. Well, it must mean they're lazy, or it must mean they're not working hard enough, or this kid doesn't participate as much. Must mean they need to work harder, right? Blame often gets shifted to kids. But instead of shifting blame to kids, I actually move here to step number 2. I ask myself, what exactly are kids left out of, right? Now, I want to give you a concrete example so that we can kind of think about how this might go. I was working with a group of kids not too long ago, and we were working across a middle school team. So this was grades 6, 7, and 8. And one of the things that we discovered among some of the 7th grade students was that 7th grade students were having a really difficult time. As the weather warmed, 7th grade students were having a really difficult time, and it got to the point where 12 children had been suspended. So 12 children in the 7th grade had been suspended. And that was a really hard number for us to deal with. And I remember thinking to myself, we hadn't suspended 12 kids in the previous year. And so to have 12 kids suspended in a spring felt really intense. And so I sat with my principal and really started to wonder out loud, how is it that we have suspended 12 kids this spring? And here's what made that even more difficult. Of the 12 kids that were suspended, 9 of them were Black or brown boys. 9 of 12 is 75%. Now, here was the difficult thing for us at school, that Black or brown boys make up less than 20% of our school population. And so what we saw in very clear numbers, right? 12 suspensions, 9 of them Black or brown boys, but Black or brown boys make up less than 20% of our school population. So what we saw was a disproportionately racist outcome at our school, even though we're kind people, right? That 75% of the disciplinary action was going to 20% of the population, right? And we are all kind people, we're all nice people. And so we had to ask the question, this is clearly the group that's left out if we kind of consider question number one. But then we had to ask, well, what are they left out of? What seems to be the issue or the challenge here? And as we thought about the boys, as we talked to the boys, as we looked at all of our behavior data, one of the things that we realized was of the 12 suspensions, the inciting incident that led to the suspension, for 10 of those incidences, the inciting incidents happened in a social studies room when the kids were sitting in social studies, not the same social studies room, but the kid was sitting in social studies when the infraction occurred that led to suspension. And so that led us to ask the question, well, what's happening in social studies that might be leading to this outcome? And as we examined our, seventh grade sequence of courses, one of the things that we learned right away was that in seventh grade, reading and writing were taught in a workshop-based way. In seventh grade, math was taught through inquiry and investigation. In seventh grade, science was taught through experimentation. In seventh grade, the arts were taught in a hands-on way. But in seventh grade, social studies was taught through 50 minutes of bell-to-bell lecture. So we asked ourselves, could it be that lecturing at kids for 50 minutes when all of their other classes are robust and hands-on is creating the kinds of conditions that's leading to suspension? Right? That we asked, again, who are the kids who are most left out? That was our Black and brown boys. What are they left out of? Oh, it seems like sitting still for 50 minutes was creating those conditions that led to that. So then we went to question number 3. How might I reimagine social studies, that experience of sitting for 50 minutes? How might I reimagine it to give kids more access? Now you see that my emphasis here is to fix injustice, not kids, right? That if I am seeing large amounts of kids grappling or struggling with the thing, the problem isn't the kids. The challenge, the problem is the thing, right? And so I got to sit with my 7th grade team and we got to reimagine, how might we reimagine social studies so that kids have more opportunities to use their hands and to work collaboratively so that there are fewer behavior infractions that lead to suspension, right? And so we reimagined social studies. We thought about lots of things like centers, and we thought about like small group discussions and Socratic seminars, right? And then what happens is we test our idea. Once we have these ideas, we test them, right? So we say, if I have more small group discussions and fewer lectures, what's going to be the rate of suspension? Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? If I have more opportunities for kids to engage in centers, what am I going to see in terms of their coursework? What am I going to see in terms of their general affect, right? That this is database problem solving, right? That it would have been really easy and unjust to blame the children, right? And here's what happens. In so many schools, we say, oh yeah, the problem is the boys, right? Or in so many schools, we say, oh yeah, the problem is those kids with IEPs, or the problem is those kids who get to school late. But to really then take a step back and say, how might we reinvent how we do things so that more kids can thrive? That is what we mean when we say equity work. And so as I close out, this short discussion and make time for question and answer, one of the things that I want to think about is that I'm asking teachers to do all of this work while we're all very tired from this ongoing pandemic, while we're all very tired from all of the changes that have happened around us, right? And so one of the things that I think about when warming up for equity work is I like to see equity work as restful work, right? That we all know that the antidote to fatigue is rest, right? And one of the things that has been happening in teacher discourse all over this country is people are using words like self-care, self-care, self-care. But as those words are thrown about, it feels really toxic because nobody ever makes the time for self-care. And so with We Got This, I've been really intentional to think about, what does it mean to care for myself in a context, in a teaching context, in an educational context, which is already so hard and so demanding, right? And so I think about rest, and I think about the reality that as educators, we have a really toxic history with rest, right? That I don't know about you, but when I think about rest for myself, what often happens for me is there's something at school that might fatigue or tire me, right? So I run home and I rest up and I feel better, right? But then what ends up happening is I return to the very same thing that fatigued me in the first place. And so that need for rest still exists. It feels like this cycle, right? And I call that subsistence rest, where something in the community or something at school fatigues me. So I go home and I rest up and I feel better. But then I return to the very same thing that fatigued me in the first place. In We Got This, I advocate for a different kind of rest. In We Got This, I advocate for restorative rest. Restorative rest is defined by two principal attributes. It's defined by creativity and by innovation. Restorative rest is when something at school fatigues me, when something at work fatigues me. And I know that part of my rest has to be learning how to change or reimagine the thing that fatigued me. So that way, when I return to work, I'm not returning to the same thing that fatigued me in the first place. Rather, I'm returning to clarity. And that clarity allows me to do my actual work. When I think about the future that I want for me and my family and the kids that I serve, this is freedom, right? And so thank you for joining in today's book discussion. I hope this has interested you in, reading or rereading or talking about or thinking about We Got This. I look out at all of you and I understand how intensely busy you are. And so that you have made time to be here with me today means the world. Thanks so much. I want to pause right now. I'm going to take a look at the chat, see if there's any questions, but just thank you for being who you are, not just for kids, but for our profession. Yeah.
Thanks, Cornelia, so much. We appreciate all of your message. There aren't any questions within the chat, so you don't have to scroll through, but lots of good comments you may want to look at.
Awesome.
For myself, I think restorative rest definitely hit different. I was looking at that and found so much real life application to that as well. A couple other the big takeaways that I saw within the chat, and I kind of noted on my sheet, was just reimagining what it means to do school, that we have the ability to restructure that. And then I really liked how you provided that real life example of reflecting inward. Let's not place the blame on the students, but how can we do things differently? And I love that you provided that example of this is what it looks like, and this is how we, were able to address that within the building that I work in the context that I work. So I appreciate that. There's definitely more about self-care in the chat and restorative rest and many other things. But if you do have questions, please pose them. We are a little bit over. I am fine staying on for a little bit. But for those of you who aren't able to, we want to respect your time. So I will go ahead and put the evaluation link in the chat as well. So we ask that you complete an evaluation for today. And one other thing as well, we do have a winner of today's book. So Lori Katz, you were the first one on today, ready to go. So if you want to email me, I'll go ahead and send you a copy of Cornelius's book so that you have that to reference and follow up today's chat with. It looks like there is one question within the Q&A, Cornelius.
Yeah.
What is the lever to help our teachers change?
I think all the time about several things. I'm a huge pop culture person. I grew up in the early 80s. And so Bruce Lee was a hero of mine. Saturday Morning Kung Fu. And so I'm going to quote Bruce Lee here. But one of the things that Bruce Lee said is that the only thing I can change is myself. That there is nothing I can do that changes others. And so I've really thought a lot about what it means to change myself in the context of a team, right? That when I work actively to change myself in the context of a team, that change becomes contagious, right? And many of us who spend time with kids, we know this. Every child psychologist has taught us, right? That when we think about kids, especially kids in classrooms, there's so many times where we try to, for example, change the behavior of a kid, right? So if a kid is giving us a hard time, we try to change the behavior of a kid. And we know that child psychology teaches us that you can't change a kid's behavior, rather you change how we respond in classroom to the kid's behavior, right? And so the same applies to our colleagues. And so when I think about change, one of the things that I think about is how might I do something in my room that is visible and public so that the people around me see that thing. Another concrete example, one of the things that we're experiencing here, and it's around the country, so it's not just New York and New York State, but for a lot of our girls and scores in science, that's another area of disproportionality, right? Where around the country, we're seeing that girls get high grades, girls like participate fully in classrooms, but then when it comes to testing, girls don't score as high as boys. And of course, for me, I'm in secondary, testing dictates college admissions and things like that. And so that's an area of concern of mine when I think about equity. And I've been talking to my colleagues about this forever. I'm like, we really need to pay very close attention to how we might reimagine things so that our girls can score powerfully. And, people are like, Cornelius, we're busy, they just need to work harder. But I'm like, no, but we're experiencing this around the country. We can't just say to girls and women, work harder in science, that there has to be something happening that we can change that gives people more opportunity. And one of the things that I discovered here is that a lot of our practice labs were after school in the evenings. And so if you want to stay and study more science, a lot of our practice labs were from 3 to 6 after school. And so if you go to a practice lab after school, that means you're at school until 6 and you have to walk home after dark. And a lot of our parents were not okay with their daughters walking home after dark. And so when you look at our practice lab, who stays after school to practice, it's mostly boys. And so boys are getting that extra support that our girls weren't getting because it was unsafe. And so I simply asked the question to my grade team, what would happen if we offered practice lab during lunch? What would happen? And almost immediately, you noticed that practice lab became 67% girls, because it wasn't that the girls didn't want to work hard. It wasn't that they didn't want to invest. It was that walking home after 6 is dangerous in New York City, right? And it's not safe, right? And so it's that idea that, it would have been really easy to say, oh, the problem is the girls. They're just lazy. They just don't want to do their science. But I really had to step back and say, well, what are the conditions at school that have put extra barriers in the way of girls getting science done, right? And so when I think about change, that's the kind of change that I'm thinking about, right? And often if I'm waiting on the mindset of my colleagues to change, nothing will ever happen. So I just go do it myself, right? But I think one of the important things to name is that every historical figure that we have ever admired, they didn't wait for everybody to get on board. That getting everybody on board or on the same page is the enemy of progress. That every person that we have ever admired went out and did it first. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We do have a couple more questions. Let's just pick one more. If you notice, Nicole posted the most recent one, and we'll close out on this question if that's okay with you, Cornelius. How do we move away from people fixing students and move towards embracing the differences and insisting on high expectations?
I think I'm a big believer in that repetition, that we have inherited a scholastic tradition that is rooted in 17th century beliefs about kids, right? The kids should sit still and listen to adults, and the kids who can sit still and listen are good, and the kids who can't sit still and listen are bad, right? And for those of us who serve kids with learning disabilities, we understand that this is radically untrue and this is inhumane, right? And so I think it's really, really important to continue to really lean into the reality that there is nothing about kids that is broken, right? We learned this in the disability rights movement in the 70s, right? That there is nothing about a wheelchair user that is broken. There is nothing about someone with an auditory processing disorder that is broken, right? There's nothing that is broken about kids. Rather, it's our institutional inflexibility that is broken, right? And so if I am institutionally inflexible and am not willing to change my school so that it can accommodate a wheelchair user, then the problem ain't that kid, the problem is me, right? That if I am institutionally inflexible and I am doing school in a way that does not accommodate kids who have difficulty with auditory processing, the problem ain't that kid, the problem is me, right? And so I think the same applies to equity. If we have a school that is institutionally incapable of supporting our multilingual Mexican students, then the problem ain't our multilingual Mexican students, the problem is us. If we have a school that is institutionally incapable of supporting our girls or our Black kids, the problem ain't our girls or our Black kids, the problem is us. And so that's a message that I keep repeating, but then it's also a message that I keep living, right? And so again, going back to my example with science, everybody was saying, well, the girls just need to work harder. If they work harder, they'll score better, right? And so everybody kept saying that, and I'm like, no, the problem is that if you want to work harder, you've got to stay until 6. And if you're a girl who has to walk home after dark in New York City, it's not safe for you, right? And so I said, like, well, what would happen if we changed ourselves? And so changing ourselves in that context meant, instead of offering lab support after school, let's offer lab support during lunch. And again, immediately girls started showing up. And so that disproved the theory, because the prevailing theory was girls were lazy. That was the prevailing theory. They don't want to come after school. But when we changed it to lunch, 67% of the people who came to tutorial were girls. And so it disrupted that prevailing theory, right? But so many of our prevailing theories are sexist or racist or classist, right? And so the prevailing theory that girls are lazy and don't want to come to science help, or the prevailing theory that Black boys are bad, or the prevailing theory that kids with disabilities are just lazy and don't want to work hard. Like all of those prevailing theories are rooted, again, in that 17th century belief that, oh, if you sit still and do what an adult tells you to do, you're good. And if you don't, you're bad. And so I'm really into this idea of institutional flexibility. That has to be the way forward.
Absolutely. Thinking differently than the way we thought before. Yeah. Cornelius, I so appreciate your time today. And I know that everybody else who's on now does as well. And I think we could pick your brain all day with questions. However, we do need to close out for today. But again, thank you. Thank you all for participating. If you have other questions for Cornelius, please feel free to email us and we'll get them the questions. Yeah. Also, definitely a great book. We highly recommend We Got This. So go pick it up and learn more about what Cornelius has been talking about today. Again, thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you all for being here. Take care.